"You're just a guest here, Dorothy. Guests don't make the rules." My son-in-law said it while standing at my kitchen counter with a stack of mail in his hand, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Men like Craig had a talent for putting cruelty in neat packaging. They said hurtful things in practical tones and then acted surprised when anyone called them hurtful. He flipped through envelopes like they belonged to him. Electric bill, pharmacy circular, property tax notice, a cream-colored flyer from the Methodist church down the road. He sorted them into piles on my counter. Beneath the brass light fixture, my husband and I installed ourselves one summer when Renee was still little enough to stand on a chair and hand us screws. I was standing 4 feet away with a dish towel in my hand and 41 years of mortgage payments behind me. The refrigerator hummed. The late afternoon light came through the window above the sink in a clean golden rectangle, the same window where I used to watch my daughter ride her pink bicycle up and down the cul-de-sac when she was 7, hair coming loose from its ribbon, knees grass-stained, voice carrying all the way to the mailbox. Renee stood in the hallway with Daniel on one hip. Lily was on the living room floor building something elaborate out of magnetic tiles. The television was on low. A commercial for allergy medicine played and ended. Nobody said a word. Craig finally looked at me then, but only briefly. He had the sort of face people trusted at first. Open forehead, clean beard, pleasant mouth. The face of a man who could speak at a homeowners association meeting for 12 minutes about drainage and make people nod like he had done them a favor. He was not a loud man. Loud men are easier to identify. Craig preferred the tone of reasonable authority. The tone that implies the matter has already been decided and only your acceptance remains. "You stay here," he said, tapping 2 fingers on the counter as if clarifying a simple misunderstanding. "We manage the household. That's the arrangement." Arrangement. I folded the dish towel in half once. Then again. My hands were steady. That steadiness was something people often mistook for softness. It was not softness. It was discipline. 30 years as a school librarian had taught me how to keep my face composed while chaos circled the room in sneakers and backpacks. It had taught me how to speak calmly to angry parents, defensive principals, and children who thought rules were something invented to insult them personally. Calm was never the same thing as powerless. I set the towel down carefully beside the sink. "I see," I said. I turned and walked to my room. I did not slam the door. I closed it gently, the way you close things when you want to be certain they stay shut. I had turned 68 that March. My husband, Robert, had been gone for 4 years. And the house Craig had just informed me I was a guest in had been mine long before he ever parked his truck in the driveway. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around the room that had once held only sleep and marriage and winter colds and quiet Sunday mornings. In the 4 years since Robert died, it had become something else. A place where I folded laundry no one thanked me for. A place where I retreated so younger people could spread themselves through the rest of the house and call it family life. A place where I had slowly, foolishly allowed myself to shrink. The bedspread was the blue quilt my sister mailed from Tennessee after the funeral. My reading lamp sat on the same nightstand Robert built in his garage shop from leftover oak. On the wall across from me hung the framed black and white photo of us standing in front of the house in 1987 with a realtor's sign on the lawn and a ridiculous amount of hope in our faces. We were young in that picture. Not young in the magazine way, not glamorous, just young enough to think effort and decency would cover most things. We had bought the house in stages, really. The original structure had been smaller than what stood there now. A plain ranch on a modest suburban lot, with one narrow front hall, a cramped galley kitchen, and carpet that smelled faintly of old smoke no matter how many times the previous owners claimed they had cleaned it. Robert looked at the backyard and saw possibilities. I looked at the kitchen and saw work. Between the two of us, that was how most things got done. He imagined, I organized, he built. I paid the bills on time and made sure nothing slipped through cracks just because life was busy. When Renee was born, we planted a dogwood in the back corner of the yard. Robert called it her tree from the beginning. Every decent girl should have a tree somewhere, he said, kneeling in the dirt with his shirt sleeves rolled up. And what happens if she grows up indecent? I asked. He smiled without looking up. Then at least the tree had a fair chance. That was Robert, dry, gentle, and always somehow steadier than the room around him. We added the sunroom when Renee was in middle school. We refinished the cabinets ourselves one August when the air conditioning went out and every drawer front stuck to our hands. We changed the roof after a storm season, so wet it felt biblical. We hosted birthday dinners, sleepovers, graduation parties, and one memorably disastrous Girl Scout cookie planning meeting where 12 children destroyed 2 batches of brownies and clogged the downstairs toilet with paper towels. The house had held all of it, the ordinary miracles and the ordinary wear. And after Robert died, when the house turned too quiet too fast, I made the mistake so many women my age make. I confused company with comfort. Renee called 6 weeks after the funeral and asked if she and Craig could stay for a little while. There was stress in her voice, real stress, not theatrical. She had a 4-year-old daughter, Lily, and was 6 months pregnant with Daniel. Craig was, in his words, between positions, a phrase he used so often it lost all meaning. Renee was on leave from the dental office, where she worked the front desk and managed insurance headaches for people who thought their molars were victims of conspiracy. "We just need a few months, Mom," she said. 3, maybe 4. Just until Craig lands somewhere stable and the baby comes and we get our footing. I said yes, before she finished asking. Not because I was naive. I had lived too long to confuse need with gratitude. But she was my daughter, and I could still hear in her voice the same small thread of tiredness I used to hear when she called from college after studying too late and pretending she was fine. There are tones a mother never stops recognizing, even when her child is 40 and has children of her own. They arrived in October with a moving truck much larger than 3 months required. I noticed that immediately. I noticed the second dresser, the toy bins, the boxed kitchen appliances, the rolled-up rugs, the desktop monitors packed in foam, the extra crib still flattened in cardboard. I noticed Craig directing the movers into the guest room with the firm confidence of a man who had already pictured the furniture in place. I noticed how Renee kept talking while she unpacked, filling the air with practical details so no one had to dwell on scale. Young families have a lot of things, I told myself. Temporary can still look like a full household if children are involved, I told myself. This is grief talking. Don't be suspicious of your own daughter, I told myself. That first night I made the soup Renee always loved growing up. Chicken with egg noodles and too much black pepper. It's still not enough pepper, she said automatically after the first spoonful. And for one brief moment, I felt relief so strong it almost embarrassed me. My girl was still in there somewhere. Under the exhaustion, the motherhood, the marriage, the practical voice. Still the same girl who had once sat cross-legged on a kitchen stool and asked me what kind of life book people had when no one else was home. When Daniel was born in December, the house filled with the soft disorder of a newborn. Burp cloths, bottles, warm laundry, tiny socks with no regard for mates. The particular smell of baby soap and sleep deprivation. Lily climbed into my lap for stories while Renee nursed. I drove to appointments. I folded onesies. I held Daniel against my shoulder in the blue haze of 3 a.m. and listened to him breathe. I was useful. Usefulness, I learned after widowhood, can feel a lot like purpose if you are lonely enough. Craig was never exactly rude in those early months. He was simply never warm. He called me Dorothy from the beginning, which I respected in principle. Not every son-in-law wants to call his wife's mother Mom, and I had no need to force false intimacy. But there was a clippedness to the way he said my name, as if it belonged on a label maker. Dorothy. Hand me that. Dorothy. Do you know where the wipes are? Dorothy. We moved a few things around. Always information. never invitation. At 6 months, the guest room became their room without formal discussion. Craig moved in a heavier dresser from storage, then a television, then a desk with 2 large monitors and a cord arrangement that looked like a telecommunications hub. Renee told me he needed a better setup for interviews and freelance work. "It's only until things stabilize," she said, touching my arm in that apologetic way people do when they want agreement disguised as affection. I said nothing. Then the living room shifted. My caramel-colored sectional, the one Robert and I chose together 15 years earlier on a Saturday, after eating pie at a diner off Route 9, apparently did not support Craig's back properly. A new couch arrived the next Tuesday while I was at Kroger buying cereal Lily liked, and the pharmacy brand lotion that kept my hands from cracking in winter. I came home to find my old sofa in the garage under a moving blanket, pushed crooked against the wall beside Robert's toolbox. Craig was standing in the doorway when I walked in carrying grocery bags. "How do you like it?" he asked. The new couch was gray, low, expensive-looking, and completely lacking in soul. It smelled like showroom fabric and fresh adhesive. "It's a couch," I said. He smiled the way people smile when they decide not to hear what was actually said. Renee rearranged the kitchen that summer. She said it made more sense this way, is a phrase with a lot of damage hidden inside it. My good mixing bowls moved to a cabinet I could not reach without the folding step stool. My everyday plates went to the lower drawers because Lily could help set the table. The old dish rack disappeared, and a larger one took half the counter near the sink. There was suddenly a charging station for devices on the breakfast nook sideboard, where Robert once kept the radio he used to listen to baseball games. The worst offense, strangely enough, was the coffee maker. Renee bought one of those glossy machines that connected to an app on your phone. It beeped, glowed, and required 3 separate instructions to produce a cup of coffee that tasted vaguely tired. Craig loved it. He liked saying things like, "It syncs with my morning routine." I retrieved my old percolator from the pantry and used that instead. "Vintage," Craig called it one morning, and not kindly. There were 100 smaller things. Craig changed the thermostat and acted inconvenienced when I changed it back. He reprogrammed the garage keypad without telling me because, as he put it, we need a more secure system. He referred to the backyard as our yard, while chatting with the Hendersons over the fence, even though the Hendersons had known me and Robert since the first year Renee started school. At a 4th of July cookout, he told one of the men from down the block that he had big plans to open up the kitchen and dining room eventually. Eventually. I was standing 5 feet away with a platter of deviled eggs in my hands, and he said it as though I were part of the landscaping. I laughed softly, because women of my generation were trained to use laughter the way a handyman uses painter's tape, to cover seams, prevent mess, buy time. Later, in bed, I stared at the ceiling fan turning slow circles and wondered why the word eventually had lodged under my skin like a splinter. Renee stopped asking whether I minded watching the children. At first she would say, "Mom, would it be okay if we ran out for an hour?" Then it became, "We're heading out around 6. Then, "Lily's got her pajamas on already." The shift from request to assumption happens so gradually you can almost miss it. One day, someone is grateful for your help. The next day, your help has become part of the floor plan, and I let it happen. Not because I was weak. I want to be clear about that. I let it happen because I loved my daughter and my grandchildren, because I knew what it was to be a tired young mother, because grief makes people permissive in strange directions. I had lost Robert, and suddenly the house was full again. Shoes by the door, lunch boxes, sippy cups, the cartoon songs Lily liked, a baby monitor crackling at night. Even Craig's silences were, in their own unwelcome way, proof that I was no longer alone. I also made another mistake women like me make too often. I told myself patience was a virtue, when, in practice, it had become a kind of surrender. I kept waiting for Renee to come back to herself. I waited for the version of my daughter who noticed things. The one who used to say thank you after small kindnesses. The one who would have heard Craig refer to my house as ours and corrected him without needing a second thought. But motherhood and marriage and fatigue had narrowed her focus. She was always hurrying, always tending to the nearest fire. Lily's preschool forms, Daniel's ear infection, Craig's frustration, grocery budgets, school pickup, work schedules. She was not cruel. That would have been simpler. She was consumed, and consumed people often do the most damage by omission. The moment I understood how far things had gone was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning in September, just over 2 years after they moved in. I came downstairs early to make tea and found Craig in the kitchen on the phone, standing where Robert used to stand while reading the sports section. He had one hand braced against the counter, and that careful, low voice men use when they are discussing numbers and want to sound competent. He glanced at me and held up one finger without pausing his conversation. The gesture was so reflexive, so thoughtless, that it almost impressed me. I filled the kettle and stayed by the sink. I was not trying to eavesdrop, but Craig was not trying to be quiet. "Yeah, the square footage works," he said. "We'd knock out the wall between the kitchen and dining room, open the whole thing up. The back sewing room becomes the office. The little bedroom at the end of the hall would make a nursery down the road." A pause. Then a short laugh. "No, we're not in a rush. She's not going anywhere." She. Not Dorothy. Not my mother-in-law. Not your mother-in-law. Just she. An object with assumed permanence. A lamp, a fence line, a seasonal inconvenience. I set my mug down on the counter so carefully you could have balanced a coin on the rim. My face stayed neutral. Years of dealing with children had made that reflex permanent. You do not react first when someone is showing you who they are. You let the information finish arriving. Craig ended the call and turned around. He looked momentarily startled that I was still there. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," I replied. I took my tea to the back porch and sat in the chair Robert built from cedar boards one fall when he decided store-bought patio furniture looked too eager. The dogwood leaves were just beginning to turn. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started. A delivery truck hissed to a stop and then moved on. The neighborhood was waking up in all its ordinary suburban ways, and I sat there with my tea cooling in my hands and felt a clarity settle over me so slowly and so completely it almost felt physical. Not fury. Fury burns fast. This was something quieter and more durable. The kind of clarity that arrives when patience has finally turned on itself. The conversation happened that evening because some conversations choose their own hour. Renee and Craig were at the kitchen table after dinner, laptops open, speaking in the efficient half-sentences married people use when they have already privately agreed on the important parts. Lily was in the living room watching a baking show. Daniel had fallen asleep in his high chair, and Renee had taken him upstairs. The dishwasher ran. A legal pad sat near Craig's elbow, covered in figures and little boxes. I sat down across from him with my tea. Renee looked up first. Mothers know before anyone says it. Something in her face tightened. "Mom? I heard your phone call this morning," I said. Craig closed his laptop slowly, like a man in no hurry because he believes calm belongs to him by birthright. "That was a preliminary conversation," he said. "Nothing's been decided." "About who's home?" I asked. The room went very still. Renee pressed her lips together. Craig leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach, already arranging the expression he wore when preparing to explain reality to people. "Dorothy," he said, "we've been thinking long-term, about what makes sense for everyone. This house is more than one person needs, and frankly, it's being underused." Underused. I looked around my kitchen, my blue ceramic bowl by the fruit stand, the small crack in the tile near the pantry door, the curtain hems I had sewn myself one winter, the mark on the baseboard where Renee rammed a toy stroller into it in 1989, underused. "And what have you decided makes sense for me?" I asked. Renee leaned forward. "Mom, that's not fair." "No?" I said. "Then help me understand the fair version." Craig let out a breath through his nose. We're talking about a sustainable arrangement. There's that word again, I said. Renee's voice softened the way it did when she was trying to contain a situation rather than resolve it. You've said yourself the upkeep is a lot. The yard, the taxes, all of it. Craig and I can manage that. We can make the house work for the family. For the family, I repeated. I looked at Craig. The family being whom, exactly? He met my eyes then, properly, and I saw the impatience beneath the politeness. Saw how tiring he found my refusal to accept framing as substance. You live here with us, he said. We're all sharing the space. I own this house, I said. He made the smallest motion with one shoulder, not quite a shrug. You stay here, he replied, but the household has changed. Then, because he had already rehearsed it, because this was the sentence he had brought home with him and polished on the drive, he said the line that would finish whatever softness remained in me. You're just a guest here, Dorothy. Guests don't make the rules. Renee said his name sharply. Craig. But she did not say, that isn't true. She did not say, this is my mother's house. She did not say, you will not speak to her like that. Her objection was to tone, not content. That mattered more than she knew. I folded my hands around my mug. The dishwasher clicked. In the living room, someone on television said the words, preheat the oven, and the audience laughed. I see, I said. Craig mistook my calm for retreat. I watched it happen. Relief touched his face for half a second. Then I asked, in 2 years, what have you contributed to this house? He frowned. That's not really the point. It is exactly the point. Renee glanced between us like a woman watching weather move in over open water. We've bought groceries, Craig said. We've handled repairs. We've improved the place. One repair, I said, the water heater, which I reimbursed you for in full the following Friday. I have the check copy. His jaw tightened. I turned to Renee. What else? She looked down at the table. I've paid every property tax bill since 1987, I said. Every insurance premium, every roof estimate, every appliance replacement, every plumber, electrician, tree trimming service, and furnace inspection alone since your father died. I have never asked you for rent. I have never asked you for utilities. I have never asked you for reimbursement for groceries, childcare, or wear on this house. Craig opened his mouth. I raised one hand. I'm not finished. He closed it. You moved a couch out of my living room without asking me. You reorganized my kitchen. You changed codes and thermostats and routines. You speak about my yard and my walls as though they are already under your authority. And now I find out you've been discussing renovations with a contractor I have never met. Renee's eyes filled then, but I had lived long enough not to let tears automatically reorder truth. Mom, she whispered. I looked at her, really looked. My daughter, 40 years old, tired, ashamed, defensive, still, somehow, still my little girl in one corner of my mind, and a stranger in another. You may love me, I said softly, but you have not been seeing me. Nobody answered. I stood up and pushed my chair in carefully. I'm going to make a phone call tomorrow, I said. I suggest both of you spend tonight remembering what it means to live in a house that does not belong to you. I went to my room. I did not sleep much, but I was not agitated in the way they might have expected. I was clear. That kind of clarity is rare, and when it comes, you must honor it. At 8:12 the next morning, I called my attorney. Gerald Whitmore had handled Robert's estate and updated my will twice since. Dry, precise, and incapable of wasting either words or starch, Gerald looked like the sort of man who had been born in a navy blazer and only later permitted himself different fabrics. His office was on the second floor of a brick building downtown above an insurance agency and across from the county records office. There was always coffee too weak for drinking in the waiting room, and framed certificates arranged with such symmetry they looked mildly offended by disorder. "Dorothy," he said when I came in that afternoon, "what has happened?" I told him, not dramatically, not with embellishment, just the facts. The move-in after Robert's death, the extension, the furniture, the kitchen, the contractor call, the guest comment. Gerald did not interrupt. He took notes on a yellow legal pad in a handwriting so precise it resembled print. When I finished, he removed his glasses, cleaned them once with the edge of a cloth, and put them back on. "The deed is in your name alone," he said. "Clear title, no encumbrances, no co-ownership, no transfer, no life estate, no recorded interest of any kind. The house is yours outright." I knew this already, in theory. Still, hearing it spoken in that office with county-stamped copies in front of him felt like oxygen. He turned one page of the file toward me. There it was in black and white, dull and powerful as a courthouse hallway. My name, the parcel description, the recorded transfer after Robert's death. Lines and words carrying more force than years of trying not to make anyone uncomfortable. "If you want them out," Gerald said, "we do this formally. Written notice, reasonable time, document everything. Be civil, be consistent. Do not argue about sentiment. Sentiment is where people try to move the goalposts." I almost smiled. "That sounds like Robert," I said. Then Robert was right. I chose 60 days because of the children. Gerald offered 30. I said 60. Not because Craig deserved more, because Lily deserved stability, and because I wanted no story later about being cruel, rash, or vindictive. I had no interest in giving anyone the comfort of calling my self-respect an overreaction. Gerald drafted the notice while I sat there. He used phrases like possession of premises and termination of permissive occupancy, and I watched each sentence appear with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has spent too long being treated as decorative. Before I left, he made 2 copies for me and placed the originals in a large cream-colored envelope. "Dorothy," he said as I stood, "people often assume widows won't enforce boundaries because they mistake loneliness for compliance. They are not the same thing." I looked at him. "No," I said, "they are not." The week that followed had the tension of a house that knows weather is coming. Craig grew quieter, which on him meant more deliberate. He spoke with the careful politeness of a man conserving outrage for strategic use. Renee watched me in glances, as if trying to determine whether I had become someone new or whether I had always been this person, and she had simply stopped noticing. I began noticing things more sharply, too. The way Lily still asked permission before taking cookies from the tin. The way Daniel reached for me every morning when I came downstairs, because in his little body I still belonged to comfort. The way Craig had begun laying his keys on the hall table Robert built, as if the shape of a routine could become ownership if repeated enough. At church that Sunday, I sat through the sermon, the announcements, and a bake sale update I barely heard. During coffee in the fellowship hall, Eileen Morrison from 2 pews over touched my sleeve and asked, "How are things at the house?" It was a simple question, kind, ordinary. I nearly told the truth. Instead, I heard myself say, "busy." Women smiled in sympathy. Busy is a respectable form of trouble. Busy does not require them to imagine your son-in-law calling you a guest in your own kitchen. On Wednesday, I stopped by the hall closet looking for an umbrella and found a stack of flattened boxes labeled office, cables, desk, tucked behind my winter coats, as if permanence had been waiting there with the vacuum cleaner all along. I stood looking at them longer than necessary, not because cardboard mattered, because I had become so practiced at stepping around other people's claims that I needed to relearn the shape of my own. Thursday evening, Craig brought up money. We were in the kitchen. Renee was upstairs bathing Daniel. I was peeling apples for a pie Lily had requested after seeing one on a cooking show. Craig came in with his laptop under one arm and leaned against the counter. "We've put a lot into this house," he said. It was the opening move of a man preparing an argument he believed sounded noble. I kept peeling. Have you? He placed the laptop on the counter and turned it toward me. A spreadsheet, columns, a few highlighted cells, numbers, furniture, appliances, improvements, household support. I set the paring knife down. You made a spreadsheet? He missed the point entirely. I'm trying to be realistic. So am I said. I wiped my hands on a towel, went to the drawer by the phone, and removed the small accordion folder where I kept reimbursement records, property invoices, and check copies. I had kept records my entire married life, not because I distrusted people, because life gets slippery when you stop writing things down. I opened the folder and laid out 3 check copies, a hardware receipt, and the payment memo for the water heater. This reimbursed the repair, I said. I slid another toward him. This one covered the delivery fee on the couch I did not ask for. Another. This is for the gutter cleaning service you charged to your card while I was at the grocery store. He stared. I went back to the apples. There is a difference, I said, between spending money in someone else's house and acquiring a claim to it. He was silent long enough that I could hear the water running upstairs through the pipes. Finally, he said, You keep records on everything? I looked up. I always have. He had the grace to appear unsettled. Good, I thought. Let him be unsettled. Friday afternoon, I asked Renee and Craig to sit at the kitchen table after the children were down for naps. I had the folder in front of me, not theatrically, simply because I wanted the documents near my hands. The deed, the tax statements, the notice from Gerald in its cream envelope. Things that should never have been necessary in my own home, and yet had become necessary precisely because I had waited too long to make paper do what love could not. Renee clasped her hands together. Craig sat very straight. I began before either could speak. I should have said some of this much earlier than I did. Craig's expression hardened slightly, as though preparing to endure a lecture. This house belongs to me, I said. Every room, every wall, every decision about what happens here belongs to me. That is not a metaphor, and it is not emotional language. It is legal fact. I slid the copy of the deed across the table. Renee did not touch it. Craig glanced down, then away. I called Gerald, I continued. He has prepared formal notice. You have 60 days to find a rental and arrange your move. Renee's face changed first. Not shock, exactly. More like the moment a person realizes the bridge they assumed would hold has an actual edge. Mom. I raised a hand gently. I'm not done. Craig leaned forward. 60 days? Dorothy, that is not realistic with the market the way it is. It is generous, I said. His mouth tightened. Renee looked stricken. You'd make us leave? The question landed oddly, as if the leaving were the injury and not the years that had made it necessary. I am asking you to return my house to me, I said. There is a difference. Craig gave a short, humorless laugh. This is unbelievable. No, I said, and my voice was soft enough to make him look at me. What was unbelievable was hearing myself described as a guest in the house I paid for. A flush climbed his neck. Renee closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she looked older than she had the day before. I didn't know he said that, she whispered. You were standing there, I said. That did it. The truth of that sat between us heavy and plain. She had no answer. I slid the envelope toward them. I will help with the children while you look. I will help pack. I will do what I can to make this manageable, but you are leaving. Craig stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. This is because you overheard one phone call and decided to be offended by a conversation about planning. No, I said. This is because you mistook access for authority. He stared at me. For the first time since I had known him, I think he saw something he had not accounted for. Not anger, not sentiment, Not the wobbly guilt he could talk around. Just finality. He left the room without another word and took the stairs two at a time. A door closed overhead. Not slammed, but not gently either. Renee remained at the table. Her eyes were wet in that determined way people have when they are trying not to cry, because crying feels too much like losing the argument. "Did we really make you feel like that?" she asked, after a long minute. I could have said, "It's fine." Women of my age can say, "It's fine," with the skill of diplomats. I did not. "You didn't set out to," I said. "I believe that. But somewhere in the business of your own lives, you stopped seeing mine. You saw the house. You saw help. You saw childcare. You saw spare space. And I let you." She stared at the grain of the table. "I kept thinking it was temporary," she said, "that we'd get our footing and it would all settle. But you were comfortable," I said gently. "And comfort has a way of extending itself." She wiped one eye with the heel of her hand. "Craig's going to be furious." "Craig may feel whatever he feels," I said. "It changes nothing." She gave a tiny, pained smile then. So brief, I almost missed it. "Dad would have handled this better." My throat tightened. "He would have handled it sooner," I said. That earned a real, sad smile. "He would have done it over dinner and somehow made Craig think it was his own idea." I laughed, unexpectedly and honestly. For a moment, the room opened. Not fixed, not healed, but opened. The days after that were not pleasant, but they were clean. There is dignity in clean conflict. You know where the furniture is. Craig moved through the house like a man wearing shoes half a size too small. He was formal with me, careful. His civility arrived polished, so I would know the effort it cost him. "Good morning, Dorothy. Will you be needing the car this afternoon, Dorothy?" "I'll move these boxes, Dorothy." Each sentence carried the message beneath it. "You have made this awkward." I did not take the bait. Awkwardness was not fatal. Erasure had been worse. Renee began looking at rentals in earnest the next week. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone and a legal pad and asked practical questions she had not asked before. "How far is this from Lily's school? Do you think this street looks safe? Would 2 bedrooms be a mistake with the kids getting older?" I answered when asked. Not because I had changed my mind, but because motherhood does not evaporate just because disappointment arrives. One night, she knocked on my bedroom door. That alone struck me. For 2 years, she had come in and out of rooms, like someone crossing shared ground. Knocking meant she remembered something older than convenience. She held a small cardboard box in both hands. "I found these while packing the hall closet," she said. "Can I come in?" I nodded. Inside the box was a strange small archaeology of my own displacement. My mother's silver brooch, a recipe card in Robert's handwriting for his Sunday chili, a framed photograph of Renee on her first day of kindergarten in a denim jumper and white socks with lace trim, the little ceramic bird Lily had given me the previous Christmas and that I had assumed Daniel broke. Things that had drifted out of place when the house stopped being arranged around me. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not about the objects. We both knew that." I sat down in the chair by the window and rested the box on my lap. "I know," I said. She stood there twisting her wedding ring. "I let Craig make this into something it never should have been." "You did," I said. She winced, not theatrically. "Honestly, there is a kind of honesty that sounds harsh, only to people unused to hearing it spoken plainly." "I thought you'd say not to worry about it," she said. "That would be easier," I replied. "But not truer." Her eyes filled again. "How do I fix it?" "You already started," I said. "You're leaving without making me the villain for asking. That's where it begins." She came and sat on the edge of the bed then, close enough that I could smell the baby shampoo from Daniel's bath on her sweater. "I hate that I became this person," she said quietly. I looked at her profile, so familiar and so altered by time. The same nose she had at 16. the same slight crease between her brows when she was upset. My child, a mother herself, a woman old enough to know better and tired enough not to. You are not one person, I said. None of us are. You became comfortable. You became distracted. You became willing to let someone else do the speaking because it was easier than correcting him. That's not the whole of you, but it is part of what happened. She leaned over and hugged me. Longer than she had in years. Not the quick side embrace of busy adulthood, a real hug, one that carried shame, love, relief, and the old shape of us all at once. I held her. I did not rescue her from the feeling. That was another old habit I was done with. A week later, Craig tried one last practical argument. We were in the driveway after he had come back from seeing a rental and was in the sort of mood men get when reality refuses to admire them. The kids are settled here, he said, loading folded strollers into the back of his truck for no reason other than needing to move objects. Lily's school is close. Daniel's routine is here. We're trying to think about stability. I stood beside the recycling bins with a grocery list in my hand. Stability is important, I said. He nodded, pleased to hear agreement enter the room. That's exactly what I'm saying. No, I said. You're using the children to ask me for what you feel entitled to. That isn't the same thing. His face changed. I continued before he could interrupt. You are their father. Find them a stable home, but do not ask me to pretend the solution to your stability is my disappearance. For once, he had nothing ready. That seemed to bother him most. Moving day came on a gray Wednesday in late October. The air had that thin, honest cold that belongs to American suburbs in late fall. Not dramatic weather, just enough to make people keep their coffee cups in both hands. The dogwood was letting go of its leaves one by one. The maples farther down the block had already turned. A rental truck pulled into the driveway at 7:40. Craig handled moving the way he handled most things, efficiently, without visible feeling, as if labor itself could preserve dignity. Boxes came down, toys, kitchen gear, crib parts. The desk with the twin monitors, coats, lamps. The gray couch I had never liked stayed because it had, technically, replaced mine. I decided not to discuss it, one battle at a time. My old sectional remained in the garage, waiting for its return like an old dog that had been unfairly boarded. I brought out coffee at 8. 1 cup for Renee, 1 for myself, 1 for Craig, which I set on the porch railing near where he stood, taping a box marked bath. Kids. He looked at it, then at me. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, I replied. That was enough. Lily turned moving into theater. Every forgotten stuffed animal required an announcement. Every trip back inside became a performance. She hugged my legs 3 separate times before 10 and asked whether the new house would still have a snack drawer. It better, I told her, or I'll have serious concerns. She laughed, delighted, and went flying toward the front yard again in pink sneakers. Daniel did not understand any of it. He pointed at the truck, pointed at the dogwood, pointed at a squirrel, and demanded to be picked up roughly every 17 minutes. I held him against my shoulder near the end and breathed in that warm, impossible, particular smell of a 2-year-old child who has never once considered mortgage law and never should. Renee made 3 trips back for forgotten things: the wipes, the folder with school forms, Lily's winter coat. Each time she came back into the house, there was a flicker on her face. Not exactly regret, more the recognition that leaving a place after living in it is not the same as leaving a place you were merely passing through. At 11:30, she stood in the kitchen with her purse on and looked around. It doesn't even look like we were here, she said softly. I knew what she meant, and also knew it was not true. The house had marks, scratches, rearrangements, air that had shifted around habits. Still, I understood. Households heal quickly, I said. She swallowed and nodded. Then there was only Craig left on the porch with his keys in his hand and the final box already loaded. He looked like a man who had prepared several speeches and discarded them all on the walk down the hall. "I wasn't trying to take anything from you," he said finally. The truth was, I believed him. Not entirely, not nobly, but mostly. He was not a cartoon villain. That would have made this easier and less useful. He was a man who had been given ground and started building on it without asking whose foundation he was standing on. Men do that every day in ways large and small. They mistake accommodation for approval. They mistake silence for transfer. They mistake women's endurance for consent. "I know," I said, "but you should have paid more attention." He held my gaze for a second, then nodded once. Not agreement. Recognition. He extended his hand. I shook it. Then the truck pulled out of the driveway. I stood at the front window longer than I needed to while it backed carefully, turned at the end of the cul-de-sac, and disappeared past the Hendersons' mailbox. The street quieted. A man across the way was blowing leaves into a neat orange-brown pile. Someone farther down started a leaf blower that whined and stopped and started again. The ordinary neighborhood noises returned to scale. When I turned back into the house, the silence was different than it had been before they came. It was not empty. It was restored. I went first to the garage. My old sectional sat under the moving blanket exactly where it had been left 2 years earlier, one corner dusty, one cushion slightly compressed from the angle. I pulled the blanket off and ran my hand over the armrest. Still good. Still solid. Still mine. The next day, the Hendersons' son came over with a dolly and helped me move it back into the living room. By Friday, the gray couch was listed for pickup and gone. I put my lamps back where I liked them, returned the side table to the window, took the charging station off the sideboard, put the radio back, retrieved my mixing bowls from the upper cabinet and returned them to the shelf beside the stove, where hands like mine could reach without climbing. I brought the percolator out for good and stored the app coffee machine in the pantry with all the politeness of a woman who has absolutely made a decision. These were small acts. That is precisely why they mattered. Reclaiming a life rarely arrives in one dramatic courtroom moment. More often, it comes in the form of drawer space and thermostat settings and deciding which cup goes on which shelf. That evening, I called Gerald to confirm the move was complete. "Good," he said. "I'll mark the file closed." File closed. Such plain words for such a private revolution. After dinner, I put on Robert's old brown cardigan, the one with the worn elbows, and went out to the back porch. The cedar chair creaked the same way it always had. The dogwood leaves drifted down without hurry. Somewhere, a screen door slammed, and from another yard came the faint smell of someone grilling something heavily marinated and unnecessary for a Wednesday. The sky was doing nothing remarkable. No sunset worth photographing. No storm. No revelation. Just the ordinary Midwestern dark settling in around roofs and fences and the edge of the yard. And it was exactly what I needed. I sat there and thought about all the women I had known in my life who had lived versions of this story in different houses with different names. Women who had given and then continued giving long after anyone around them still recognized it as a gift. Women who had turned themselves into cushion, into convenience, into atmosphere. Women who had mistaken love for the obligation to disappear. I thought about how shame works on women like us. Not loud shame, not public scandal, the quieter kind. The embarrassment of admitting you let something go too far. The humiliation of realizing you have been trying so hard to be generous that other people have quietly relabeled you as available. The absurdity of needing documents to prove what should have been obvious. I had spent 2 years behaving as if keeping the peace were the same thing as preserving dignity. It is not. Peace built on your own erasure is only surrender wearing respectable clothes. The next Sunday at church, Eileen asked again how things were at the house. I looked at her over a paper cup of weak coffee and said, "Much better." She nodded, and because she was a woman over 70, with a face that had learned to read what others left unsaid, she touched my hand once and said, Good. That was all. It was enough. Renee began bringing the children by on Saturdays after that. Not every Saturday. Not automatically. She called first. Would it be all right if I bring them by for a couple hours? Yes, I'd say. Or sometimes. Not this afternoon, honey, I have errands. The first time I said no, just because I wanted a quiet afternoon to myself. I sat at the kitchen table afterward and smiled into my coffee like someone getting away with something. Lily still came for cookies. Daniel still reached for the dogwood leaves. Renee still looked tired, but differently now. More like a woman carrying her own life than leaning it against someone else's. Craig came twice in the first month and stayed in the front hall both times. He was courteous, careful, slightly formal forever, I suspect. That was fine. I no longer required emotional ease from people who had once benefited from my silence. Winter came in, then Christmas. I put my nativity set back on the mantel where it belonged, brought out the brass candlesticks Robert used to polish with newspaper, hung the old glass ornaments carefully, including the lopsided one Renee made in second grade that had once been packed into a box labeled seasonal, garage, and forgotten behind Craig's desk equipment. I made the peppery chicken soup on the first snow day and left the radio on in the kitchen all afternoon. The house, relieved of negotiation, began sounding like itself again. Floors settled. Pipes ticked. The percolator burbled. Wind moved through the yard and found no one to ask permission from. Sometimes, late in the day when the light slanted across the sink just right, I would remember that moment at the counter when Craig said I was a guest, and I would feel not anger exactly, but gratitude for the injury. Not because it was deserved, because it was clarifying. Some sentences arrive in a life like matches. They burn away all the damp excuses at once. I do not think of myself as a woman who triumphed. That language has always sounded too shiny to me. I think of myself as a woman who finally stopped pretending not to understand what was happening in her own house. There is a great deal of power in that. Not the loud kind. Not the power men perform in meetings and driveways and heavily worded emails. A quieter kind. The power of naming the room correctly. The power of saying this is mine, and meaning not just the deed, but the life inside it. The power of understanding that boundaries do not destroy love. They reveal where love was real and where convenience had been wearing its coat. One cold evening near the end of January, I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the backyard while the coffee finished in the percolator. The dogwood was bare, the grass had gone brittle and dun-colored. The porch chair sat under a pale wash of winter light. The window above the sink reflected part of the room back at me. My dish towel hanging exactly where I left it, the bread box, the bowl of clementines, the curtain hems I sewed 20 years earlier, my kitchen, my counter, my light, my house. And if you have ever been made to feel temporary in a place built by your own labor, if you have ever swallowed something true because you were afraid of the space truth would leave behind, then hear me when I say this. The space is not empty. It only feels empty when you have been taught to fill it with everyone else. Stand in it anyway. It was yours all along.